Sponsored by Raycon, yay.
Hey babe, I got something to put in your plot hole.
Right, stop that! Silly! And a bit suspect, I think.
After ripping on bad movies for the last few months, I thought it might make a nice change to do something a bit more cerebral. So let's put on our thinking caps and have a nice fireside chat. That cozy enough for you? Pulled out the two-tone lighting as well. We're getting extra pretentious today. If you've been following my channel since the ye olden days of yore, you'll remember that around about 2.5 years ago, which is like a century in internet years, I made a video on plot holes. I think it's quite an interesting subject, and the discussion around it doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon. It seems like every few weeks some tweet goes semi-viral declaring that plot holes are either irrelevant when judging the quality of media, or they just don't exist at all. I didn't think that the idea that plot holes were a thing was a particularly controversial one, but then again, this is the internet. But plot holes are one of the most frequently invoked criticisms of media, and unfortunately, it's not always in a good way, which has only given more fuel to those who want to dismiss the importance of plot holes entirely. I've been wanting to do a follow-up video on this subject for quite some time, as I felt that there were some arguments that I could have made better, or just didn't make in the first place. And there were some examples that I used that I really shouldn't have, because they weren't good ones. And I can't help but feel that I got a bit too confrontational and snarky, and that may have taken away from the message. This video isn't going to be about calling out anybody in particular, as tempting as the drama views are. I just wanted to expand on my thoughts on this topic, because in my time reviewing stuff, I've called out plot holes on many occasions, and I've seen some pretty egregious ones. So I'm going to try and argue my case for why I believe that plot holes can affect the quality of media that they belong to, as well as respond to some common sentiments I've seen from naysayers. I won't be able to put this matter in its grave, because again, the internet will argue about this nonsense until civilization collapses and we're all dining on wall insulation. But hopefully I can at least bring some clarity to what is a very messy discussion, as I argue why every hole is indeed a goal. No, I will not stop the innuendos. Sue me. This was filmed over multiple days, by the way, so my neckbeard gets a little bit stronger as the video goes on. Just to warn you. Also, because I'm a bit of an amateur, stuff will move around and lighting will change. It's fine. Just pretend it's ghosts. Alright? Oh, and in the interest of keeping things visually interesting, I'm going to have a bunch of hole-related images there in the background. Shout out to Twitter for helping me harvest them.
Did someone mention holes?
Cthulhu? What are you doing here?
I was on my way to a booty call with that guy from my octopus teacher, and I thought I'd drop in.
Isn't the mere sight of you supposed to drive me mad, or something?
Foolish mortal. You sat through the kissing booth too. You're already insane.
Fair point.
Anyway, have you noticed that you have multiple holes in your face?
Yes?
Well, I know something you can put in those holes.
Please don't say what I think you're about to say.
Earbuds.
Oh, okay, right. I thought I was going to have to age restrict the video.
Premium wireless earbuds from Raycon, that is. These delightful little things will fit comfortably in those holes of yours thanks to their discreet design, and they'll stick to you more surely than one of my tentacles.
Please don't talk about tentacles.
And they couldn't be quicker or easier to set up via Bluetooth.
How do you even know what Bluetooth is?
And with their excellent levels of noise isolation, added bass, and up to 6 hours of battery life, they're perfect for experiencing the scintillating sounds of a gaming marathon without annoying your neighbours.
Do you even have ears? Like, how does that work?
They're already great value, but you can bag yourself a pair at even better value by clicking the link in the description or going to buyraycon.com/cynicalreviews to get 15% off your order.
And how are you even talking to me right now? I thought you were some kind of incomprehensible eldritch being.
And of course, you'll be helping to support this fleshy gentleman. That's buyraycon.com/cynicalreviews, link in the description.
That was weird. So first off, what is a plot hole? Strictly speaking, it's when an event in a story goes against certain facts or rules that have been previously established in that story, thereby creating an inconsistency and or an explanatory gap. These can include outright contradictions or events that should be impossible, but also those that are so illogical or unlikely that we can consider them implausible in the absence of a good explanation. This differs from a contrivance, which is an unlikely event that exists for plot convenience, but isn't necessarily a contradiction. Now, of course, facts and rules can change as a story goes on, but they have to be justified by explanatory causal factors. And when such justification isn't forthcoming or isn't explanatory enough, then we have a plot hole and a problem. We can break plot holes down into three main types. Firstly, there are events that contradict pre-established rules of the story's universe. For example, in the first Terminator movie, it's established that the time travel machines can only transport living material like flesh, not non-living material like weapons or machines. Schwarzenegger's Terminator was able to travel back in time because it was encased in living tissue. And yet in Terminator 2, the T-1000 is somehow able to do this despite being completely made out of metal. It could be that it's somehow imitated living flesh, but that's a massive stretch, and it's never explained. This is a serious problem because it means that the central conflict of the movie should be impossible according to the universe's own rules. This could have been easily fixed, but it wasn't. Also, consider Toy Story, in which the toys have to conceal the fact that they're alive. But Buzz Lightyear, who doesn't know he's a toy, also does this despite not having the same motivation. This plot hole is less serious than Terminator 2's, but it still creates major issues because it means that a character acts in certain ways despite this expressly contradicting their pre-established characterization and psychology. Second, there are events that contradict other events in the story. In the total mess that was The Predator 2018, we're told that the Predator came to Earth to help the humans fight against the super predators. Except that on multiple occasions before this, the Predator straight up murdered humans without hesitation and made no attempts to communicate. And it isn't just that the humans believe this, which would also make no sense based on how the Predator has behaved. The film is actively telling us that this is what the story is, despite it completely contradicting the Predator's actions, which means that the story is utterly implausible. In another example, Jurassic Park 2, the T-Rex has somehow slaughtered the entire crew on the ship, including the captain, despite being trapped in the hold. While this isn't a particularly serious plot hole, it's still an impossible event that is never explained and should not have occurred. And third, there are events that are so illogical or improbable that they become ridiculous. And for this category, we're going to go to my arch-nemesis on Twitch, David Cage. In the game Heavy Rain, FBI agent Norman Jayden facilitates the escape of the #1 suspect in the origami killings, Ethan Mars. It would be extremely easy for the police to tie him to this, as he was last seen by a police officer in the room with Ethan. There's no chance he could have successfully covered this up. But at no point does his crime ever get discovered, and he suffers no consequences for it, which is absolutely absurd. This is only possible because the police in David Cage games are about as competent as a brain-damaged sea lion. More egregious than this, though, is where a story has to outright lie to you in order to make something happen. Also in Heavy Rain, it's revealed that the private investigator Scott Shelby is in fact the origami killer. And the game tells us that he killed the owner of the typewriter repair store in order to destroy evidence tying him to the murders. But the scene in which the player controls Shelby offers only about a 10-second window in which this could have happened, which was not enough time. This supposed event is simply impossible. Also, the game allows you to hear the thoughts of the characters you're controlling, including Shelby. And nowhere does he ever even think about the fact that he's covering up his tracks, despite this being his driving motivation throughout the whole game? This is a case where the story had to actively deceive its audience in order to make a twist happen, because there was no way it could have worked otherwise. And this creates a massive plot hole. Plot holes can occur for a number of different reasons. Sometimes they're the result of a particularly turbulent production process, where the story gets messed up through rewrites, reshoots, and re-edits, as was the case with The Predator. Sometimes they're the result of missing information that was actually included in the original script, or even in a deleted scene. In my previous plot holes video, I brought up the case of Indiana Jones and how he was supposed to survive on the outside of a submarine in Raiders of the Lost Ark, which was actually explained in a deleted scene. And sometimes they're the result of bad writing, lack of due care and attention, or simply apathy. But regardless of the reason for its existence, if the explanation or justification isn't in the final product, then it's a plot hole. But why do plot holes matter, and why should we care about them? Inconsistency and a lack of sufficient explanatory justification are bad in and of themselves, and are both flaws in a story and errors in the craft of writing. Consistency is good, inconsistency is bad. Justification is good, lack of justification is bad. I take this to be self-evidently true and not warranting of further explanation. If you don't accept these as basic principles, there isn't anything I can say to persuade you. This has to be a given. But beyond this, there are three main reasons why plot holes are important and why they should be taken into consideration when judging the quality of media. First off, they break suspension of disbelief. Suspension of disbelief is incredibly important because it allows us to buy into the premise and mechanics of stories despite them not accurately reflecting our real-world experiences. But this can only go so far. However fantastical, stories still have to abide by some basic and fundamental expectations about how plots are structured and how events interact with one another. Change doesn't happen for no reason, and contradictions shouldn't exist. We can suspend our disbelief to accept that a story's universe works differently in certain ways than our own, but we shouldn't be expected to do so when those rules change or events contradict each other without explanation. And for many people, this is indeed a step too far. Because they explicitly clash with those fundamental expectations I just mentioned, plot holes can be incredibly jarring and take us out of the experience. These glaring flaws remind us that we're involved in something artificial and thus ruin the immersion that the media was trying to create. Second, they can ruin the emotional investment. Any good story should make us want to be engaged and emotionally invested. And part of that is accepting the rules and events the story presents us with and assuming that they're of some importance. When a creator contradicts those rules or events and refuses to justify it, what they're effectively saying is, those things don't matter. And if they don't matter, then why should we get emotionally invested in them? Why should we care about the revelation that the Predator is meant to be helping our heroes when the film's events explicitly contradict that? Why should we care that Shelby is the killer when the game had to outright lie to us and break its own rules in order to keep that information from us? Plot holes can also do this in more specific ways. For example, by undermining the achievements of the protagonist and the threat of the antagonist. If a protagonist is only able to succeed because of a plot hole, as with Ethan Mars in Heavy Rain, then their victory feels cheap, unearned, and just a bit insulting. And if an antagonist does something really stupid and nonsensical, then it undermines the credibility of their supposed threat. Like the aliens in Signs, who despite being deadly allergic to water, decide to invade a planet that's mostly made up of water? Like, what? Or more recently, in the Snyder Cut of Justice League, Darkseid and his entire army completely forget where the Earth is. The place where he suffered his worst defeat and a grievous wound? Again! What? Even if these plot holes don't outright break the story, they do force us to seriously consider whether we should care about what's going on. And third, plot holes are the result of bad creative practices. Many plot holes exist because the writer wanted something to happen in the story but didn't think they had to justify it, couldn't find a way to, or just didn't care. Some directors have even admitted that their works contain plot holes, but that they considered them unimportant. And yes, internal consistency and justification are just some aspects that should be taken into account when crafting a story. And other aspects like character development, theme exploration, and emotional resonance are also important. But plot holes aren't just a problem that should be swept under the rug, because they can, and sometimes do, have an effect on how successful a film is at developing its characters, exploring its themes, or having an emotional impact. If you're not thinking about them at all, then you're missing out on an important part of crafting a story. And if you just don't care about them, then that's kinda lazy. And by saying they don't matter, not only are you disregarding that aspect of writing, but you're also doing a disservice to all those writers who go to great lengths to make sure their stories both obey their own rules and sufficiently justify their events. You're saying there's no difference between a story without any inconsistencies or impossibilities and a story full of them. And by doing this, you're excusing flawed and mediocre stories. Frankly, we can do better than this, and we should have higher standards for the stories that we write and consume. Now, of course, there is a lot more that could be said about this, but hopefully I've said enough words in a smart enough way to make you agree that plot holes are at least worth discussing. Now let's take a gander at some common sentiments and supposed arguments to the contrary. Again, not calling anybody out, but these are all things I've seen out there in the wild. I don't care about plot holes. Good for you. To at least some extent, I'm trying to look at media objectively, not merely subjectively, within my own tastes and preferences. Of course, some of what I've said is subjective, and objectivity is another huge and controversial topic. But I'll just state that that's the position that I'm coming at this from. Just because you don't personally care about something doesn't mean that it isn't important. You wouldn't say something like, "Oh, I don't care about character development," and then expect to be taken seriously.
Well, I didn't notice that plot hole.
Same thing. That's completely subjective and not really worth anything. Just because you didn't notice a flaw doesn't mean that it isn't a flaw.
Actually, that particular plot hole isn't actually a plot hole.
Like I said earlier, the discussion around plot holes has unfortunately been poisoned by the focus on so many bad examples. Some of these plot holes aren't valid because they have a credible in-universe explanation. Probably the most famous of these is the eagles in Lord of the Rings. The Fellowship couldn't just fly them to Mordor because they would be easily spotted and intercepted. And also, the eagles tend to stay out of other people's affairs. They helped Gandalf out because he was their friend, but they tend to stay away from other races. Admittedly, this could have been better explained in the movies, but there we go. Some of these examples aren't valid because even if they were true, they still wouldn't count as plot holes. It could be because it's actually a contrivance, or a bad character decision, or some other type of bad writing. And then there are some that are just outright false. And I've actually been guilty of this. One of the most commonly cited plot holes comes from The Karate Kid, in which the hero wins the tournament by kicking his opponent in the face, a move that was explicitly banned by a referee beforehand and should have led to his disqualification. It's a perfect example of a plot hole because it contradicts the film's own writing and breaks the plot. There's just one problem though. It's bullshit. Nowhere in this entire scene do the referees ever say that kicks to the head are disallowed. And in fact, multiple characters are awarded points for, guess what? Kicks to the head. I didn't do my due diligence in my previous video, and I apologise for that. My bad. Ultimately though, this is a moot point. Just because some plot holes aren't valid doesn't mean that none of them are. All this proves is that we need to be more discerning about the ones we choose to focus on.
Actually, that plot hole is explained outside of the movie?
If a plot hole is in the final product, then it's a plot hole. If the explanation was left out for some reason, then maybe we can be more sympathetic towards the writer, but it's still a plot hole. You can't write an essay, leave out a crucial paragraph, and then go, well, I wrote it in my first draft. Doesn't count.
Plot holes don't make a story bad, what are you talking about?
It's important to realise that plot holes vary in their seriousness and the impact they have on the quality of a story. Darkseid's amnesia, dumb as it is, doesn't have that much impact on the rest of the story, because that story would be unchanged even if he didn't have amnesia. The Terminator, Toy Story, and Heavy Rain plot holes, though, are very serious, because they either affect the initial setup of the story or the progress and resolution of that story, and the narratives would be drastically different if the consequences of these plot holes actually played out. So, basically, it depends on the plot hole. But also, the presence of plot holes, however serious, might not by itself make a piece of media bad. I don't think anyone would dispute that Toy Story and Terminator 2 are fantastic movies because they've got so much going for them. As with every other factor that needs to be taken into account when making these value judgments, it's a balancing act. And in any case, plot holes are still flaws. Plot holes don't necessarily make an amazing story bad, but they certainly don't help.
You only care about plot holes in stuff you think is bad already. You don't care about the ones in stories you love.
In my case at least, that's not true. Like Terminator 2 and Toy Story. I love those movies. I love them. But they have bad plot holes. This isn't an argument against plot holes, it's an argument against inconsistency. Which is kind of ironic.
Movies aren't about logic.
Stories may not be about logic, but they still have to involve logic to a certain extent, and they do have to abide by the rules they establish and the events they present to us. Otherwise, they're basically cheating us, for reasons I've already explained.
I think you'll find, good sir, that emotional payoff is more important than logic.
This is one I see come up over and over again like it's some kind of either-or. It's not, and it never has been. You can do both. If your story is perfectly logical but fails to convey any emotion, then yeah, it's failed. But if your emotionally compelling plot makes absolutely no sense, then that's another kind of failure. And I would argue that the best way to deliver emotional payoffs is to ground them within the rules of the story's universe, and to make sure that they can be explained according to the story's prior events. Otherwise, it feels cheap, unearned, unjustified, and therefore unsatisfying.
This story isn't conventional and doesn't have to follow these rules.
There are always going to be weird little exceptions. Some stories don't even try to follow basic rules of logic because they're deliberately trying to create a surreal experience. And that's fine. Hell, plot holes can even be a good thing in some cases. The Emperor's New Groove, for example, pokes fun at its own plot holes for good comedic effect. But that doesn't change the fact that the vast majority of stories do not try to make themselves this kind of exception and do follow the conventions we've discussed, and thus can be criticised when they fail to adhere to them.
Plot holes aren't valid criticism.
Addressing internal inconsistencies and lack of justification is as valid as addressing any other aspect of writing, because they do in fact have an impact on the final product. You never hear people say that you shouldn't criticise a story's pacing, or character development, or dialogue, or anything else of that nature. But for some reason, plot holes just aren't considered a valid subject of criticism? I think this may be partly due to frustration over the focus on so many bad examples of plot holes, and over critics like CinemaSins who complain about the most trivial bullshit because they think it's funny. I did say I wasn't going to call anybody out, didn't I? Oops. In connection with this,
plot holes are just nitpicks.
Again, this depends on the plot hole. To nitpick means to focus on issues that have no effect on the quality of the whole, either because they only matter to that individual, they're completely trivial, or they're downright false. If we're talking CinemaSins level of pedantic, then yeah, that's nitpicking. They're basically the definition. But to say that an outright contradiction or unjustified event that has a major impact on the progress of the story is just a nitpick? That couldn't be further from the truth. Which brings us to the next objection.
Plot holes are just surface level criticism.
Again, it depends. At their most serious, plot holes are issues with the fundamental structure of the story and how it progresses. And since the story forms the spine of whatever piece of media it belongs to, the thing around which everything else is formed and flows, then discussions of those issues can be the furthest thing from surface level. Which brings us to the final objection.
Talking about plot holes is bad criticism.
Again, if we're talking CinemaSins style criticism, then yeah, that's trash, and no one should take it seriously. And if you only focus on plot holes, then sure, you're narrowing your scope too much and you're missing out on a lot of other important aspects of crafting a story. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with wanting stories to be internally consistent and wanting events in those stories to be properly justified. That should be a basic standard that we adhere to, along with other basic standards for what makes a story good. And to criticise stories when they fail to meet this fundamental standard, and to criticise writers when they fail to meet this fundamental standard, is both perfectly legitimate and, ultimately, valuable. Because in the long run, hopefully, it will lead to better writers and better stories. Or at the very least, less of the ridiculous bullshit that gives me an aneurysm. A boy can dream, right? Oh shit, I got a bunch more of these images and we're near the end, so we're going to do a rapid fire round. Ultimately, plot holes are flaws. You may not notice them, or care about them, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist, or that they don't matter. Stories are worse off for them, and their presence means that something has gone wrong in the creative process. So can we all collectively agree that they should be yeeted from existence? Or is that asking too much? I think that might be asking too much. So yeah, that's my thoughts on plot holes and why I think they matter, for what it's worth in this crazy, crazy world. There's a hell of a lot more that could be said, and I've had to state things in sentences or paragraphs that require essays worth of elaboration. So feel free to add to this discussion in the comments and let me know your thoughts. Or just leave a dislike, if you haven't already. And maybe next time you see someone say plot holes don't matter, you can send them this video. Or not. I don't know. I'm not your dad. Unless you want me to be. Yeah, that was a bit weird. I'm sorry. And don't worry, I don't intend on making this style of video regularly, but if you have enjoyed this fireside chat style format, maybe I can make them more often. Again, let me know in the comments. Fuck's sake. There's just one teeny tiny little problem with that, though.
It's bullshit.
I almost deep-throated my mic there. Thanks for watching, folks, and to Raycon for sponsoring once again. Check them out to support the channel, link in the description. You can also pick up some merch on Bonfire, pledge your support on Patreon, or become a YouTube channel member. Patrons and channel members get early access to uncensored versions of videos without ads or sponsorships, as well as a mention in the credits. Follow me on Twitch if you're interested in streams, follow me on Twitter for updates, and join my public Discord server if you want to hang out. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.